to the Daily Bite. I'm your host, Pastor Steve Andrews. Today we read from 1 Kings chapter 7. Solomon was building his own house, 13 years, and he finished his entire house. He built the house of the forest of Lebanon. Its length was 100 cubits, and its breadth 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. And it was built on 4 rows of cedar pillars, with cedar beams on the pillars. And it was covered with cedar above the chambers that were on the 45 pillars, 15 in each row. There were window frames in 3 rows, and windows opposite windows in 3 tiers. All the doorways and windows had square frames, and window was opposite window in 3 tiers. And he made the hall of pillars. Its length was 50 cubits, and its breadth 30 cubits. There was a porch in front with pillars, and a canopy in front of them. And he made the hall of the throne, where he was to pronounce judgment, even the hall of judgment. It was finished with cedar from floor to rafters. His own house, where he was to dwell in the other court back of the hall, was of that workmanship. Solomon also made a house like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter whom he had taken in marriage. All these were made of costly stones, cut according to measure, sawed with saws, back and front, even from the foundation to the coping, and from the outside to the great court. The foundation was of costly stones, huge stones, stones of 8 and 10 cubits, and above were costly stones cut according to measurement, and cedar. The great court had 3 courses of cut stone all around, and a course of cedar beams. So had the inner court of the house of Yahweh and the vestibule of the house. And King Solomon sent and brought Hiram from Tyre. He was the son of a widow of the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a man of Tyre, a worker in bronze, and he was full of wisdom, understanding, and skill for making any work in bronze. He came to King Solomon and did all his work. He cast 2 pillars of bronze. 18 cubits was the height of one pillar, and a line of 12 cubits measured its circumference. It was hollow, and its thickness was 4 fingers. The second pillar was the same. He made 2 capitals of cast bronze to set on the tops of the pillars. The height of the one capital was 5 cubits, and the height of the other capital was 5 cubits. There were lattices of checker work with wreaths of chain work for the capitals on the tops of the pillars, a lattice for the one capital and a lattice for the other capital. Likewise he made pomegranates in 2 rows around the one lattice work to cover the capital that was on the top of the pillar, and he did the same with the other capital. Now the capitals that were on the tops of the pillars in the vestibule were of lily work, 4 cubits. The capitals were on the 2 pillars and also above the rounded projection which was beside the lattice work. There were 200 pomegranates in 2 rows all around, and so with the other capital. He set up the pillars at the vestibule of the temple. He set up the pillar on the south and called its name Jachin, and he set up the pillar on the north and called its name Boaz. And on the tops of the pillars was lily work. Thus the work of the pillars was finished. Then he made the sea of cast metal. It was round, 10 cubits from brim to brim, and 5 cubits high, and a line of 30 cubits measured its circumference. Under its brim were gourds for 10 cubits, compassing the sea all around. The gourds were in 2 rows, cast with it when it was cast. It stood on 12 oxen, 3 facing north, 3 facing west, 3 facing south, and 3 facing east. The sea was set on them, and all their rear parts were inward. Its thickness was a handbreadth, and its brim was made like the brim of a cup, like the flower of a lily. It held 2,000 baths. He also made the 10 stands of bronze. Each stand was 4 cubits long, 4 cubits wide, and 3 cubits high. This was the construction of the stands. They had panels, and the panels were set in the frames, and on the panels that were set in the frames were lions, oxen, and cherubim. On the frames, both above and below the lions and the oxen, there were wreaths of beveled work. Moreover, each stand had 4 bronze wheels and axles of bronze, and at the 4 corners were supports for a basin. The supports were cast with wreaths at the side of each. Its opening was within a crown that projected upward 1 cubit. Its opening was round as a pedestal is made, 1.5 cubits deep, and at its opening there were carvings, and its panels were square, not round, and the 4 wheels were underneath the panels. The axles of the wheels were of one piece with the stands, and the height of a wheel was 1.5 cubits. The wheels were made like a chariot wheel. Their axles, their rims, their spokes, and their hubs were all cast. There were 4 supports at the 4 corners of each stand. The supports were of one piece with the stands. And on the top of the stand there was a round band half a cubit high. And on the top of the stand its stays and its panels were of one piece with it. And on the surface of its stays and on its panels he carved cherubim, lions, and palm trees according to the space of each, with wreaths all around. After this manner he made the 10 stands. All of them were cast alike, of the same measure and the same form. And he made 10 basins of bronze. Each basin held 40 baths. Each basin measured 4 cubits, and there was a basin for each of the 10 stands. And he set the stands, 5 on the south side of the house, and 5 on the north side of the house. And he set the sea at the southeast corner of the house. Hiram also made the pots, the shovels, and the basins. So Hiram finished all the work that he did for King Solomon on the house of Yahweh. The 2 pillars, the 2 bowls of the capitals that were on the tops of the pillars, and the 2 lattice works to cover the 2 bowls of the capitals that were on the top of the pillars, and the 400 pomegranates for the 2 lattice works, 2 rows of pomegranates for each lattice work to cover the 2 bowls of the capitals that were on the pillars, the 10 stands and the 10 basins on the stands, and the 1 sea and the 12 oxen underneath the sea. Now the pots, the shovels, and the basins, all these vessels in the house of Yahweh, which Hiram made for King Solomon, were of burnished bronze. In the plain of the Jordan the king cast them in the clay ground between Succoth and Zarethan. And Solomon left all the vessels unweighed, because there were so many of them. The weight of the bronze was not ascertained. So Solomon made all the vessels that were in the house of Yahweh: the golden altar, the golden table for the bread of the presence, the lampstands of pure gold, 5 on the south side and 5 on the north, before the inner sanctuary, the flowers, the lamps, and the tongs of gold, the cups, snuffers, basins, dishes for incense, and fire pans of pure gold, and the sockets of gold for the doors of the innermost part of the house, the most holy place, and for the doors of the nave of the temple. Thus all the work that King Solomon did on the house of Yahweh was finished, and Solomon brought in the things that David his father had dedicated, the silver, the gold, and the vessels, and stored them in the treasuries of the house of Yahweh. This is the word of the Lord. This chapter covers the building of Solomon's own home, and it covers the furnishings of the temple. So we start with the home of Solomon. So it took 7 years to build the temple. Now we learn it takes 13 years to build Solomon's house. So almost twice as long. We're not told when he started, simply that he was building. So at some point, either before or during the construction of the temple, is likely when Solomon had started the construction on his own house. It is possible, I think grammatically too, that he might have waited until after the temple was completed, although that would have been a significant chunk of his reign to have waited that long. Now, verse 2 describes his house as being built out of the forest of Lebanon. That's how much cedar was cut down from Lebanon to build this house. And look at the length. It's 150 cubits in its length. It's 75 cubits wide, and it's 45 cubits tall, a cubit being about 18 inches. That would come out to, as we measure our homes by the square foot, it would come out to an 11,250 square foot home. That's a big place, right? I don't even want to think about how much an 11,000 square foot home might go for on the market today. It would be incredibly expensive, and this is likely more than one floor. It's 45 feet high, so it could be 3 floors, in which case your square footage dramatically would increase. Now, the hall of pillars is mentioned, but we're not given a function for it. Unlike the next hall in verse 7, the hall of the throne, which gets mentioned, and that's to be the place where his throne is as king and where he's going to pronounce his judgments. He makes an entirely separate house for Pharaoh's daughter, who he took in marriage. It's hard to say how big her house is, because we don't even know the living space that Solomon chose to live in within this, and it's comparing her living space to his. The interesting part there being they don't live together, even though they're husband and wife. Now, this is all made out of costly stones, huge stones measuring 8 and 10 cubits. That's again 12 to 15 feet stones. And you can ask your kids the question, why does Solomon's house need to be so big? I'm not sure I've got a great answer for you. It's the idea of a kingly palace. The king's palace has to be so grand. This is significantly larger than the house that Solomon built for Yahweh, for his own God. The king's house, bigger than God's house. Now, on the surface, that may not necessarily be a problem, but it might show where Solomon's heart is, where his treasure is. Now, the temple furnishings section is going to take up the rest of the chapter. And a couple of thoughts here. First, we know from the book of Exodus that when God was wanting the tabernacle to be built, he actually gave Moses essentially a blueprint. He laid it all out. This is how you'll build it. This is how you'll build the utensils and all the things, that the furnishings. He gives him that. And Moses follows it very specifically, as do Bezalel and Oholiab, the master craftsmen, that God gives to Moses to work the task. We don't have a reference like that with Solomon. There's no instruction, there's no notation that an instruction is given to Solomon by God for the building of the temple, which could very well mean that Solomon is building this house of God however he pleases to do so. Now, that can be both good and bad. The bad side of that is it allows idolatry to slip in. It allows us to start trying to fashion God to our own liking, and our pride to get in the way as well. But on the good side of things, the idea of beauty and art in the architecture of the church has long been a part of its history. As you look at the tabernacle and how exquisitely made it was, back again in Exodus, starting chapter 25, 26 maybe, as you read that section through, it was very, very expensive in its construction and design, and very intricate, very beautiful, the work that was put into that. And so there's a holiness that goes to that. You know, that the temple of God, the house of God, the church, as we think of the buildings that we have for worship today, they should be holy. They should be set apart. When you walk into them, you should recognize that you are in a separate space that is not meant for whatever purpose you want. It is a place of worship. You have come into the house of God. And there's something to that. And a lot of church architecture throughout the centuries of the church has really done a good job of portraying that. As you think about some of the ancient cathedrals and the artwork, as they hired artists and had them come and paint massive artworks on their interiors. And even to think of the artwork, the painting done in the Sistine Chapel by Michelangelo, and how he would have had to do it, on top of some kind of crazy high scaffolding, lying on his back up there. I don't even know the work that many people have put into building these giant and beautiful structures. But again, that can be prideful, and it can become idolatry, that we don't want to give those things up. The true beauty of the church is what lies within, what happens within, as God gives you his gifts through word and sacrament. That's the beauty of the church. So we can't miss that. So Solomon brings to him Hiram from Tyre. The note king is not there. So this could be Hiram, king of Tyre, but most likely it is not. It just happens to be another man who has the same name. This man being part Israelite, because his mother was from the tribe of Naphtali. That's an interesting note for us, as she married a man of Tyre and she left Israel, right? Hiram is not of Naphtali, Hiram is of Tyre. This woman left God's people, which is not a good thing. She left the kingdom, which would have been against God's instructions unless she was unfaithful to the Lord in terms of believing in God, in which case she would have been cast out. But one way or another, either she has done something wrong or her parents have done something wrong, that she is not a part of Israel, and her son is born outside of Israel, and yet Solomon brings him in for the work. He makes lots and lots of bronze things here. So you've got 2 pillars of bronze that are described that are going to go into the lobby of the temple, and they get named, right? So Jachin, which means he will establish, and Boaz, which means in him is strength. These things are 27 feet high, and another 7.5 feet when you talk about the capitals that are set on top of them. They are 18 feet in circumference. So that's sizable. I mean, I think of my arms, and if I were to try and make a circle out of my arms to hug the air in front of me, that's about a 6-foot circumference. These pillars are massive, massive works of bronze. And they're, again, beautiful. 2 rows of pomegranates, 200 pomegranates. Just talking about intricate nature workings of art. You also have the lily work that you see on the capitals too. Just a lot of beauty being put into this. And then you get a sea of cast metal in verse 23, which is a basin for water. It's 15 feet in diameter, 7.5 feet high, 45 cubits in circumference. So this is massive. It can hold 12,000 gallons of water. You might ask your kids here, what does Solomon plan to wash in this thing? It stands on 12 oxen. Their heads are facing outward with their backs and their tails facing inward underneath the basin. Then there are 10 smaller basins being made to put on these 10 bronze stands that you have in the next couple paragraphs. Each basin can hold 240 gallons. They're 6 feet high, and Solomon will put 5 of them on the north, 5 of them on the south side of the temple, with the sea in the southeast corner. And the stands are being described to us with lions and oxen and cherubim. So again, much more intricate artwork. 4 bronze wheels, meaning these things are supposed to move, that the priests can move these around. And then in addition to all of this, the pots, the shovels, and the basins that are put together as well. Everything of burnished bronze. It's made at the Jordan River, near the Jordan River, I should say, to the northeast in the plains. And Solomon doesn't even bother to measure it. He doesn't weigh it all because there's just so much. So everything has been completed at this point. He brings everything into the temple that he has made, that David has made before him, all the silver and the gold, and he stores it all in the various treasuries that he has created in this temple too, as you think of those outer rooms that he's made. The temple is complete. Now, well, it will be when we see the ark brought in tomorrow. These treasuries cause trouble in the New Testament. See if your kids can think of any of those examples. You've got the widow's mite, as she puts in her money into the temple treasury, as an example of that. That Judas is paid from the temple treasury when he betrays Jesus is another example there. And again, as a reflection, I don't think I actually said it, but a good thing you could talk about to your kids in this chapter is to talk about the architecture in your own church. Maybe it's something you do when you come to church this weekend. Maybe you just see at home as you talk to them how much they can remember. Talk about the different pieces of architecture, the different pieces of art. What are they there for? What's their purpose? How do they point you to Jesus? Because I can guarantee you almost everything in the church, and especially in our more traditional architectural designs, everything's intended to point you to Christ. So it's a wonderful conversation that you can have together as a family. Again, starting at home as you do the devotion and following it up as you come to church together this weekend.